Thanks for sticking with us, everyone. It's time for the hands-on portion of the workshop. So for this hands-on portion, I personally am going to be using VS Code. So I have the notebook that accompanies this workshop. And I'm going to be using this in VS Code to show you just another way that you can run FiftyOne queries, and you can use the FiftyOne library and application. So you can do this in a Python interpreter. You can run separate Python scripts. You can also use a Jupyter notebook, a Colab notebook, or you can even use VS Code. So there's many possibilities. You're not limited. If you have any questions about what environments are supported, you should go to the FiftyOne community Slack and ask your questions there, or you can ask your questions here in the Q&A. So the first thing that we always need to do is we need to import FiftyOne. So you can import FiftyOne without having an alias, but it'll be helpful to have an alias just because FiftyOne can be a little bit cumbersome if you're using it so much. So we tend to use FO. You also probably want to import the FiftyOne Zoo. So the FiftyOne Zoo is going to give you access to datasets that are in the FiftyOne Dataset Zoo and models that are in the FiftyOne Model Zoo. Now, if you want to list the datasets that are in the zoo, you can do that with the list zoo datasets command. So here we can see there's ActivityNet 100, ActivityNet 200, all the way down to our Quick Start datasets and VOC datasets. And you can also see all this information if you go to the Dataset Zoo. You can see all this information listed here. You can click in and see information about individual datasets. And within a Python process, within a notebook, you can not just list the zoo datasets, but you can also find datasets that have specific characteristics you're interested in. So if you want to get started very easily and very quickly up and running with an image detection, like an image-based dataset that supports object detection tasks, you can query the list zoo datasets method with the tags, detection and image, and you can get all of the datasets that have both the image and the detection tags. You can also do a similar thing for the models in the zoo. So here we're listing all of the models in the Dataset Zoo, and here we can see we have everything from AlexNet, ImageNet, we have YOLO models, lots of common computer vision models. And here we can see some of them are implemented in TensorFlow, some are implemented in PyTorch. And just to get started as quickly as possible, we're going to use the Quick Start dataset. So you can load the Quick Start dataset by just running dataset, or you can call it whatever you want. We're just going to call it dataset. And we're going to use the load zoo dataset command. And here we see the dataset is loading. And then we can explore this dataset a little bit if we would like. In a moment, we're going to explore and interact with it programmatically in Python. But before we do that, let's actually involve the app. Let's make things visual, because this is computer vision, and it is incredibly important to visualize your data and understand your data visually as well as programmatically. So we can do that by launching the app in a session. And you do so with the launch app command. Here we can see the function signature. We're going to launch the app. And you can either launch the app on its own without a dataset, or you can launch the app with a dataset. And here we're going to launch the app with a dataset. And we can see the app inside of the notebook. We can start playing around with it. We'll do that in a second. But I also want to show you something else. So with this basic command, we launch the app within the notebook. But we can also launch the app separately. So if we wanted to instead have a separate tab in a browser that had the app in it, we could do that by running launch app with the auto equals false argument. And once we've done that, we have still created the session. We can still query the session and get properties of it and attributes and actually set things about the session within this notebook. But we can also then look at, in our browser, if we go to whatever the URL or whatever the port is that this is actually being hosted at, we can go to that. So let's, for a second, look at the session, and we can go to URL. We can see it's 5151. And just like that, you can launch the FiftyOne app on its own. So now we have the app here, and we can keep this side by side with our code and perform operations and see them actually happen to our data set and the view that we're seeing of the data set in the application. Okay, so let's take a second to look at our data visually. And a lot of this might be familiar if you were following along in the earlier portions of the workshop from the GIFs, but we're going to show you how to actually interact with your data step by step. So we can scroll through our sample grid. Here we have images, and we can scroll through them, and we can see the grid is refreshing. We get more and more images as we go. We can click on one of the images or one of the samples in the grid, and we can see properties. We can see a bunch of things about it. So here we can click on an individual detection, and we can see that this is a prediction with the label sheep, and it has a confidence score that is very low. It has an ID. We can do things like select all of the visible labels, or we can hide them. You can also tag either samples or labels. So let's say this is a low confidence prediction. So we want to tag this as low confidence, and we apply that. And now in our label tags, we have a low confidence prediction. We also do not have metadata here because we have not computed that. We can compute that shortly. We have ground truth predictions, so we can just visualize the ground truth predictions by toggling off our predictions, or our ground truth labels. So here we just have toggled on our ground truth labels and toggled off our predictions labels. We can also go through and actually look at the classes of our labels. So in our predictions detections, we have 7 predictions of birds. So we can just look at those. So we can here look at birds and sheep. For some reason it thinks there's sheep in this. Maybe we can just look at bears, or we can filter by ID. And if you're like me and you're colorblind, then it might be of interest to you to know that you can change the coloring scheme however you would like. So you can color by field or instance or label, and you can refresh the colors. So if the colors are too similar or you don't like the palette, you can just refresh. Okay. Now, let's see what else we can do. We can filter all of the detections and all of the labels and all the contents of all the images in our data set using the sidebar right here. So if we wanted to filter for all of the ground truth person labels, here we see all of the samples that have a person detection in them in the ground truth. And by default, this is showing us all of the person detections, but instead, if we want to show all of the labels, all of the ground truth labels in all the samples that have at least one person detection, we can do this. We can filter by file path. And here we don't get any results because we're still filtering by label. So if we reset, then we can get an image here. You can zoom in and out. If this is too basic for you, then bear with me. We're just exploring. You can change. Here we're going to reset everything. You can change the number of images that populate the grid and the size of them. You can also add a new panel. Here we're going to add a histogram panel, and we can select which of these attributes we want the histogram for. So here, let's say we want the histogram for labels. And we can see the number of detections that, or the number of ground truth detections that had the label person, the number of ground truth detections that had the label kite, car, and so on. Now, we can also see the prediction detections. You can see confidence scores, labels. There's a lot of good information here, but right now we have to go back and forth between these two tabs. If we wanted to look at these two side by side, we could do that by pressing either of these split options. We could either split horizontally or split vertically. So let's split it vertically. And now we can see the samples in the grid, and we can see all of the histogram information, and we can resize these things however we would like. Okay, so now that we have some basic app functionality, let's go back and look at how this all interacts with Python, with the FiftyOne library. So some cool things that we can look at are, there is a very strong connection, a seamless connection between the code that you write and the visuals and the state of the FiftyOne app, the session. So here, if we just run session.selected, which gives us all of the selected samples in our session, which is this, then we get an empty list. But if we actually go and click on one, and we select it, and we go back here, then we get an entry. And this entry is the ID of the sample. And then if we wanted to, we could actually query the dataset for this sample. And then we can see a printout of the information contained in that sample. We can actually, if we wanted to, we could instantiate this as its own variable. And now let's print it out again. We can see a bunch of properties of this, and these are the same properties that we were able to see within the app, although now we can see them explicitly, and we can even see a little bit more information, for instance, the bounding box. So we have the ID, which is what we use to actually extract this from the dataset. We have the media type, which is an image, and that is inferred by the .jpeg extension. It has the tag validation. It doesn't have any metadata. It has ground truth detections, and it's got other stuff which is hidden right now, and we can actually view that if we click to this. And so it's got a lot of detections in it. But if we go back, we can actually dig into this even further by looking at properties using the dot syntax. So let's say we want the ID, which we already had. Great. What about the file path? We can get that. You can also get the file name. You can get things that are more involved. So here's the ground truth labels. And this is an embedded field. So we can dig into this even further. So this was a detections field. So it was of type detections, which is a label type in FiftyOne. And by using the dot syntax with detections, we're able to get the list of all the detections, and each of these detection labels is a label within FiftyOne itself. And then this list can then be indexed. So let's say we want the first entry here. And then we have another field. We have this detection object, and we can continue to dig in even further and get the bounding box. And this bounding box is what tells us where the detection is located within the image. And all of these coordinates are relative coordinates relative to the image width and height. Now, if we wanted information about the image width and height, then we could get that by loading the image with PIL or some other image loader, and then looking at the width and height of that by counting or getting the length and the width of the NumPy array. But we could also just use FiftyOne's built-in compute metadata method, which will compute the width and height for all of the images in our dataset. So let's see what this looks like. It's that easy. And now if we refresh the app, we can see we've got metadata, and we can filter for images that have certain numbers of pixels in their width and height and so forth. You can also do this filter with Python. Everything you can do in the app, you can do in Python. Okay, so you can, in addition to extracting or getting information about what is visible in the app with the session dot syntax, you can also set things in the app with the session dot syntax. So let's say we wanted another sample. So not this first sample, but let's say we wanted, so this is another exercise in how to index or how to get samples from a FiftyOne dataset. So if we wanted the second sample, we'll call it sample 2, and then, or why don't we even just call this sample 1? And we will get the first sample in the dataset. And now if we print this out, great. Now let's take this ID, which we could also again get programmatically, and let's set the session ID. Let's refresh this. Let's get this histogram panel out of the way. And let's take our session. Okay, so now we just set, and let's reset this. We should have a selected sample here. We can also set the dataset itself. So we can do session.dataset is equal to dataset, which sets the dataset here. And it didn't do much in this case because we already had this dataset selected. But let's say we actually wanted to work with multiple datasets. So here we can load in another dataset, and we're actually going to load in a video dataset this time. So this is the Quick Start video dataset, another one of the Quick Start datasets within FiftyOne that makes it very easy to start working with data of different types. And then we could set this, and voila, we have a new dataset selected, a new dataset in the app. And here we can actually, if we go to full screen for this, we have a different type of behavior within the app. So before we had images, now we have videos. And if we hover over one of these samples, we can see the video play. can see a snippet from the video. We can click in. We can see information about labels as we did before. We have different buttons now. So we can play the video. We can, hold on. We can choose the speed. So now we're going very slowly. We can go very fast. We can do lots of cool things with this new video visualizer. We can still filter the same way we did before. In this case, now we have frames, and these videos are made up of frames, and you can convert each frame to an image if you would like, and look at the image data set, or you can work with the videos directly. So here we can filter for vehicles. Okay. All right, so I showed you how to get the first sample in the data set. But if you wanted to get the, for instance, the 5th or the 10th sample or some other number of samples, you can use the skip view stage to do that. So here, if we want to get the 10th sample or the 11th sample, we can do this with skip 10. We can, in general, use view stages like skip, but we can also use many more view stages within FiftyOne in order to get information about and to filter our data into views that we want. So we can use, let's see, list view stages to give us a list of all of the view stages in our data set that we can apply to our data set. So we can do things like exclude, we can filter fields, we can, if we had a geodata, if we had geographic data, then we could get things that are near or within some regions. We can limit our results to a certain number of samples. We can match based on certain properties, select, or depending on the type of data that we had, we could convert to a different format. There's a question. Yes, you can convert an image data set to a video data set. That you probably, there are many different formats for videos, so you would need to be thoughtful about the way that you did that, but that is absolutely possible. So let's try out a couple of these. We could limit to 20 samples. So here we get the first 20 samples in the data set. And there's also some syntactical sugar. This allows you to index or query a FiftyOne dataset the same way that you would a pandas data frame. Here, this actually performs that view stage operation. And if you want to actually figure out what these view stages are, like each of these view stage operations corresponds to a view stage object that you can look at in the FiftyOne documentation. So here we have an example of this. So if we list the view stages, we see one of them is exclude labels, and we can use a question mark to get the docs associated with this. And we can see the signature, we can see the doc string, we can see what it returns. But then we can also see if we use the FiftyOne.exclude labels. So notice it's a different formatting, but it's the same thing that we are looking at really. This basically has the same properties. It is just a standalone object, whereas the exclude labels is the method that utilizes that. Okay, we can get random samples from the dataset. So if we here use take, this would give us random samples. So if we got the values of the IDs for these would be different than the values of the IDs for the first 10 samples in the data set. So here we're going to get the first 10 samples in the data set, and then we're going to get the values of their ID. So those are different. You could also shuffle the entire data set like this, and this doesn't shuffle in place. It shuffles, it gives you a shuffled view into the data set. So shuffled view is equal to that. And then we could, for instance, set our, so we can set session.dataset is equal to dataset. We could set session.view, shuffled view, and that gives us a different ordering of the samples. We can sort by certain properties, and the way that you create and compose very interesting, very involved filters on your data is using the FiftyOne view field. Here we can import it as F, and then we can not just sort by the value of a field, but we can also sort by or perform operations on properties of the fields or operations involving fields in the data set. So here we can sort by the number of ground truth detections by using this length method on this expression. And then we can get this. So here we are getting the samples with 0 ground truth detections, 1 ground truth detection, and then at the very bottom, we would have samples with the most. And you may recognize this image because this is one of the example images I used when we were discussing why tabular data is not a good fit for computer vision. And here we have 39 ground truth detections. Now, if you wanted to see the images with the most detections first, you could do reverse. And here we see the order has been reversed. There's no limit to the number of images you can browse in FiftyOne. People work with data sets that go up into the tens and hundreds of millions very frequently. We have users who have millions of video samples in their data sets and have no problem working with this in FiftyOne. So I know that we're getting close to time. I'm not going to go through all of these things here, but you can compose some pretty intricate filters into your data set. So you can look for views that have either a cat or a dog. You can create views with predictions that have very high confidence. There's a lot of things you can do. Your imagination is the limit here. You can also modify your data. So here we're going to create a new data set by cloning our original data set, and we're cloning a subset of that data set. We're cloning the first half, and we've named that data set with the .name property here. And if we look at this data set now with print new data set, we see that this is not a view. There's no list of view stages here, but this is a new data set with a new name. We have 100 samples in this. Now, this data set doesn't have these other samples. I already ran that. I'll stop that. So we have these other samples. And these are the samples that were not included when we generated this cloned data set. And we can do things like take 5 random samples from our new data set and delete those samples. And then when we print out the count, we have 95 instead of 100 samples. We can add samples. So we can add either samples that were already present, in which case it'll add new samples to the data set, or we can add samples that were not present. So in either case, we are getting an additional sample added to the data set, but it is adding a sample with a unique ID in all cases. So even if you already have a given file path that is represented somewhere in the data set, you will have a new sample associated with that file path. This notebook will be made available to everyone very shortly. So if you haven't already gained access to it, then you will gain that access shortly. You can add classifications, you can add detections, and you can evaluate predictions on your data set with respect to some ground truth field. I will also mention that we will cover all these topics in more depth in future workshops. We will have topic-specific workshops for many of these topics. So if we did not cover something in depth that you wanted us to go into today, thank you for your patience. And if you want to see a workshop more imminently on the topic of your interest, please join our community FiftyOne Slack and go to the workshops channel and post there.